What's going on, guys? Welcome to another episode of Healthspan Academy. I'm your host, Craig Sherrod, and joining me today is Greg Everett, who is one of the key figures in this world of weightlifting. He's the owner of Catalyst Athletics. He's been the coach of USA Weightlifting, the national champion team, Catalyst Athletics. He's the author of Olympic Weightlifting, which is an incredible read and, in my opinion, a must buy for anybody interested in coaching or even the athletics of weightlifting. And more recently, Tough, which is a great read. I'm working my way through that right now, so we'll talk a little bit about that. He's the co-host of Weightlifting Life Podcast. He's a publisher of Performance Menu Journal, and the list goes on, and there's a long list here. Just for the interest of getting this conversation going, I'll cut it there. But Greg, thanks for joining me today, man.
I appreciate you having me on.
Cheers. So I want to kick this off with how athletics began for you. I know you started pretty early in the game before weightlifting was quote unquote the thing to do, kind of popular. Was that sport kind of around you growing up, or was it other sports that kind of brought you in, or how did that all begin?
It wasn't around me at all. And people have a hard time thinking back to the pre-internet days, but they did exist. And so, I grew up in the late 80s, early 90s.
Yeah.
I graduated from high school in 1998. So the internet was just barely a thing at that point. It was like you could spend 10 minutes trying to get AOL to load stock prices, and that was pretty much the extent of it.
I remember those days.
Yeah. So there wasn't an easy way for me to find out about weightlifting, but I had always been, involved in any number of sports from a very young age, and from the standard kind of American boy sports to the more obscure stuff, road competitive bike trials, rock climbing, all this kind of stuff.
Oh, wow.
But the common thread for me was always the athletic development, the training, and in particular, the strength training side of things.
Yeah.
To a large extent, always appealed to me, or at least appealed to me more consistently than the sports themselves in many cases. Right. And so I think I was just naturally kind of drawn to that thing. So the sport of weightlifting then is kind of like, if you're somebody like that, it's the perfect synthesis of sport and training in a sense, because the training kind of is the sport to some degree. And so I don't remember my first exposure to, snatch, clean and jerk. Mm-hmm. But I do, the earliest memory I have of like really recognizing that it was a thing was Charles Poliquin's original book. Or at least I think it was the original book, Poliquin Principles. Yeah. And there was a photo of a guy from the Air Force weightlifting team doing a front squat in a singlet. And I was like, what is this guy up to? Just because everything is so, especially at that point, even more so than now, I think everything was so bodybuilding focused.
Yeah.
So even athletic training programs are very bodybuilding focused, if maybe a little bit of powerlifting flavor, but so weightlifting was this very curious thing. Mm-hmm. And so I eventually, I kind of taught myself snatch, clean and jerk, but I didn't, I didn't have a coach. I didn't have, a cool online resource like say catalystathletics.com to go learn anything from. Yeah. So I kind of just like sputtered along with it and never took it seriously until I was, in my early 20s and had access to, actual coaching and information.
Right. That's awesome. So who were your first mentors then when you did to get into finding some coaches and starting to competing?
Well, Mike Bergner was my coach. And so he was also my wife's coach. And so that was kind of a serendipitous relationship in many ways. It basically paved the way for my career and my marriage. So my life has kind of been a series of really fortunate coincidences, and then me just being eager enough and ambitious enough to follow up on them.
Cool.
But so Bergner, I moved from Northern California down to San Diego County to train with him. And so that ended up being,
like the original Mike's Garage.
Yeah. So, I was training as a competitive weightlifter, but it pretty quickly kind of turned into more of a coaching apprenticeship, and not intentionally by any means. Right. That's just kind of how it organically worked out. And so he really got me started, and it was, his generosity that I think really allowed me to be where I am, because, those early days I was, kind of maybe overstepping my bounds in a sense, where I was pushing beyond what my qualifications really were, because there was such a lack of quality information out there. And I was like, somebody has to fill this gap, because like a kid like me, 14, 15 years old, who wants to learn, where do you go? USA Weightlifting? No, there wasn't anything. I mean, now there's at least a little bit of content, but you literally could not even find a video or a description of a snatch and clean and jerk on the national governing body's website at that
That's
point,
wild.
which is insane.
Wow.
And so I started pumping out content for this stuff, even if I was, maybe beyond my, beyond appropriate for my level of experience. But
yeah, at least there was something
like no one else was doing it. So here we go.
Yeah, that's amazing. So in getting into it is an intimidating thing. And I think back, I've running my gym over the years, I've considered taking it out just for the intimidation factor, because it probably would be a smarter business decision to take it out. But for me, the benefits have always outweighed the potential risks associated with it. So when you talk to people that are kind of casually on the fence with getting into it, do you bother trying to talk them into it? And if you do, like, what does that conversation look like?
It's an interesting question, because there are so many kind of weightlifting evangelists, and it's true for any activity, right? Is like, this is what I do. I want you to do it. It's so important for you. You have to do it. And I maybe felt that way more years ago, but at this point, it's kind of like, I don't know, man, do you want to do it? And if not, that's fine too. Do whatever you want to go do curls, right on. Like, I just don't care. I want you to do what you like. But if someone is coming to me saying, and so in other words, I'm not pushing it unsolicited, but if someone is coming to me saying, hey, this weightlifting thing looks interested, but then I'm going to help them address those buts and explain why it is accessible to anybody. Yeah. And the reality is, like any physical activity, there are ways to graduate the level of complexity, the level of difficulty, so that it is truly accessible to anybody. Like, I have literally watched guys with 2 prosthetic legs do a power snatch. That's amazing. Are they going to the world championships? Of course not. But that's not their goal. Is they want to do this activity. So my point is, when someone says, well, I don't have good mobility, or I'm not fast, it's like, hell, hey, look, you got 2 arms, 2 legs, quit making excuses. If this is something that interests you, then here's how we do it. And so point being, you can scale that stuff down, so maybe you're not snatching yet. Maybe you're just doing a snatch deadlift. Maybe you're just doing snatch pull and then overhead squat. And so it might be a process of years. But that's the whole point, right? Is that's what's so pleasurable about it to the people to whom it attracts. Is that it's this ongoing learning process and a process of development, rather than just this thing that you instantaneously do well. What's the point of that? Yeah, sure enough. And I think that's kind of a good point too, is that when you break it down, you do even the assistance pieces, you're still getting a benefit, right? You're developing strength and power and speed and even a bit of coordination when you're just doing little pieces of it. And for me, that's like, I feel like anybody that's willing should at least give it a shot. And I feel like, because especially now my own interest kind of shifted towards longevity. Like, if we're trying to slow down, the whole slowing down process and coordination and speed and power, all the things that tend to slow down as we age, there's really no better tool. We're working on coordination. It kind of keeps you honest with your mobility and all this stuff. So but it's frustrating. There's people that are going to criticize it till the cows come home, mostly because it is hard, and it's the easy answer to say, like, oh, this is stupid, right? If they try it and it's too hard, and it's an easy out for them. Well, and that's the great thing about my attitude about it now, is like, that's okay. I don't mind. Like, if you decide it's not for you, then there's plenty of other people who want to do it that I can help. Yeah, exactly. And hopefully they find something that they do like and provides them what other health and mental health benefits that they need. For sure. So you kind of mentioned, like, and you alluded to this being open to anybody. Is there a prereq? Is it just like is it like a psychological prereq? Is there physical prereqs, mobility? Do you like say, like, do you ever get to a point where you're like, man, you should just spend 3 months doing mobility before you even try this? Or like, I don't think so. And that's one of the weird things I find about weightlifting is the question is, should I do powerlifting first to get strong for weightlifting before I start weightlifting? Or should I do just 3 months of mobility first. Well, no, because first of all, that's insane. Like, why would you do something else to get strong for a sport that gets you strong?
Yeah.
And with the mobility side of things, doing the movements and trying to achieve these positions as well as you can at present is a big component of developing that mobility, arguably the biggest part of it.
Yeah.
And so it is, in a large sense, an irreducible activity. Like, you have to participate in it in kind of a whole fashion to benefit from it. And that is the best way to kind of accelerate your way through that process, even though it might feel like a slow crawl. And often it is a slow crawl that doesn't get you very far, ultimately, depending on when you start, what your background is. If you can barely hold your arms overhead, it's going to be a really rough process.
Yeah.
But again, can you enjoy it? Can you get some benefit from it? Can you have fun? Is that mobility going to improve? Yes, to all of them.
Yeah.
And I honestly don't remember what the original question was, but maybe I kind of answered it.
Just whether there's prereqs. So I think we did cover that.
Oh, so you asked, a mental prerequisite. Yeah, you have to want to do it.
Yeah.
And I know that sounds like a stupid thing to say, but no, you really have to want to do it. You can't just be
it's a commitment. You can't go half.
Maybe I'll try this.
Yeah, for sure. No,
because it is frustrating. It's like any difficult thing. It is frustrating. It's not always going to work the way you want it to.
Yeah.
And it can feel incredibly slow and like you're not doing anything for long periods of time. But again, that's why you have to be someone who is not only wants to do it, but someone who derives satisfaction from a process, right?
Yeah.
And from that learning versus just an outcome kind of focus.
For sure. And obviously the harder you work towards something, the harder you're going to ring that PR bell when you finally hit that 2-pound PR in the snatch.
Yeah. Again, if it was super easy, what would be the point? What would you get from it?
Yeah. So true. I want to shift into a little bit of programming. You have a programming chapter on weightlifting. And I feel like there's different schools of thought with this stuff. What are the core principles of your programming? If you, obviously you're trying to match to the person's goals and their ability and their level. What are the first questions that you try to answer as you're working through someone's program?
I think probably the starting point for anybody is, a really fundamental assessment, and you can really break this into 2 parts.
Yeah.
What are they good at? What are they bad at? Right?
Yeah.
Strengths and weaknesses.
Mm-hmm.
And in weightlifting, the typical dichotomy is you're going to have someone who's either, got a better strength base than technical, or vice versa. Right. And so those are the 2 primary areas that you're always working on in weightlifting. Like, one or the other doesn't get you the whole way.
Yeah.
And, whichever one is worse is the limiter. So everyone's, what's more important? Well, what's more important is the one that you're worse at, because that's the one that's holding you back.
Yeah.
And so that's kind of your most basic, big, broad strokes kind of thing, where are we going to be putting more of our time and effort into getting this person stronger?
Yeah.
Or in helping them learn the lifts and develop that proficiency so that they can use its existing strength better. Right.
Yeah.
And again, that's an ongoing process where that's going to be changing somewhat, and specific. It'll get more specific. Like, okay, maybe we're a strong squatter, but our pulling is weak, or our overhead is weak.
Yeah.
Or technically we're very good with snatching, but we're terrible at cleans. Whatever the case is.
Yeah.
So that's the core principle, is that you're going to strengthen the weaknesses and exploit the strength.
Yeah. And then do you have a set time that you'll set that at, where, depending on where the athlete's at, we just program for 6, 8 weeks, 10 weeks, 12 weeks at a time when they're first getting started? Or how is that more?
I mean, the newer you are, the shorter those training blocks are going to be.
Yeah.
Because in theory, at least, they should be progressing much more rapidly, because you're learning bigger and bigger chunks.
Yeah.
Technique wise, and you're developing kind of this confidence and this competence a little more quickly than, say, someone who's been doing it for 10 years, where you were just doing anything possible to eke out 1 or 2 kilos here and there.
Yeah.
So those shorter blocks, it gives you, it's appropriate because it doesn't hold them back.
Yeah.
Right. Where if you're like, okay, you're brand new, we're going to do a 16-week cycle. We're not going to test your max snatch for 16 weeks. That's crazy. because their max snatch is probably going to go up like 5 kilos a month, without even testing it.
Yeah, true.
And so, but the other part of it too, that's really important is that in those earlier stages, you shouldn't be relying on like percentage work, which is something I typically use later on for most people.
Yeah.
Although not entirely and not exclusively. But early on, because things are changing so rapidly, you really have to take it day by day. Yeah. So I guess that would be the second fundamental thing is you have to be continually evaluating and adjusting literally on a daily basis or on an exercise to exercise, set to set basis with people. Yeah. No matter how well you have this thing planned, you have to be flexible and be willing to adjust to do what is most effective for that person at that time.
Yeah. Well said. So I've been kind of following some of your stuff on Instagram, and there's been I don't know if I just happened to see these posts, but like the tall jerk, tall clean, tall snatch. And I love those exercises just for getting comfortable getting under a bar, getting speed under a bar. What do you feel like are the most underrated assistance exercises at the moment? I mean, it's probably tough to generalize, and it depends on athlete need, but is there something that just kind of gets like put aside and probably should be done more?
I mean, those ones you just listed are tall snatch and tall clean are probably two of my favorite exercises of all time.
Yeah.
And I don't think they get used very much. And moreover, kind of similar to like muscle snatches, too often when they do get used, they get used poorly.
Yeah.
So there's a lack of understanding of how they should be executed, which means their execution is not effective in doing what this person is trying to do.
Right.
So the muscle snatch is the classic example where you're trying to, reinforce the mechanics and strengthen that turnover of the snatch, that pull under. Mm-hmm. If you do not execute that movement in the way that you pull under a snatch, well, how is that helping?
Wasting your time. Yeah.
That is the most bizarre thing. And people will fight tooth and nail and get so defensive about it. The snatch grip, no touch, clean and press, and calling it a muscle snatch. And it's like, okay, well, why do you do it this way? And it's just crickets. It's like, well, because so-and-so did it on Instagram. It's like, okay, well, why does he do it that way? Crickets. Like I literally have guys like borderline death threats on YouTube comments about it. But then when you ask them to like have a conversation, well, why? What benefit does doing it this way have? You never get a response. Never, not once in like 10 years since I started giving people crap about that stuff.
That's wild.
It's the weirdest thing.
That is bizarre. So I want to shift gears a little bit into the mobility piece and evolving with the athlete. You kind of talked about let's start with wherever you're at, start working on the mechanics, no matter where the mobility is at. But the mechanics do change. And I've struggled with T-spine mobility and overhead mobility, and my jerk and snatch will never be great. I've accepted that you're just going to be mediocre. But I'm okay with that. But I've noticed as my mobility has gotten better, the mechanics change. You're used to just pulling and hitting that brick wall. So, and that can be challenging as a coach to know, like, is this athlete capable of getting there? Are they just kind of struggling mechanically to get in that position? Is it a muscular thing, or is it still a mobility limitation? So talk about walking those type of athletes through those kind of sticking points.
Yeah. And that is an important point is if your range of motion is increasing, that means your end positions are changing, which means necessarily the mechanics have to change to get you there.
Right.
And even the path to get there can change. For example, if you have improving, internal rotation at the shoulder, that means your pull under a snatch and clean can be closer, can be better.
Right.
And so you have all these things to consider. But I think if you have, sensible programming, which means that in addition to the competition lifts and variations, you have kind of the fundamental stuff like overhead squats, snatch, push presses, presses, regular squats. You are on a daily basis watching this athlete, and their training itself is kind of your screen.
Yeah.
Right. So you're watching their positions change. You're watching how they move. And so that's letting you see, okay, well, to use your example in the jerk, maybe he or she is still leaving that bar a little bit too far forward, which is the only way they could do it initially.
Right.
But when you have them press, they're getting that bar farther back over their neck. Mm-hmm. So you're watching that range of motion improve and that position improve, but it's not being reflected in the competition lift. And so that's how you see, okay, what do we need to do to get this person to hit those positions in the competition lift? And maybe we have to do a different variation. Let's do some jerks from behind the neck.
Yeah.
Or let's make you hold your split position for 5 seconds every time. Once you've adjusted back and to feel that position, or you know, whatever the case is.
Yeah.
And so it really is this kind of like dialectical process where you're taking things from both sides to try to continue to build the most effective approach on a daily basis.
Yeah, I love that. Well spoken. The other one I like is the split press. That's like it because you're in it's like almost a more static kind of movement, less dynamic, but you're forced into the same kind of finishing position.
Right.
Yeah. Let's talk about how training has evolved over the years. You talked about like first thing you were just kind of picking up at Mike's garage, and then there's just nothing out there. And obviously there's more info now, and there's probably more material that makes you cringe more than ever.
There's a lot.
Yeah. But talk about the key changes that you've made in your approach to weightlifting as a coach versus those early years.
You know, generally speaking, obviously, the longer you do it, the more you learn, the better you understand things.
Yeah.
And so you accumulate more tools.
Yeah.
Right. So you have way more ideas on how to solve problems. And I think that's the number one biggest thing that experience brings, right? Is you encountered so many new problems and have experimented with so many ways to solve them. And you kind of find what doesn't work, what works, or what works in certain cases, but not others, whatever
Start
it may
connecting
be.
dots between different types of athletes and
exactly. Yeah. You see some patterns and so it just kind of, it forces you to become creative.
Yeah.
But I think kind of more philosophically, the biggest change for me is becoming less and less dogmatic about things. And not to say that I was ever super dogmatic about it in the first place, but my thinking was more rigid, right?
Yeah.
It was more of a, this is right, this is wrong, this works, this doesn't sort of thing. And kind of going back to my newfound maturity in my thinking, like, for example, people who don't care about weightlifting. Well, I don't care either. Right on. I kind of feel the same way with programming and technique. It's like, listen, there are things that definitely work and there are things that definitely don't, right? There are those two ends of the spectrum.
Yeah.
Running 10 miles a day does not get your legs strong, as an extreme example, right? There are things we can just cross off the list.
Probably won't get you better at snatching either.
It's not going to do a lot of good for you in weightlifting. But as you get towards the middle, there is a lot of variability, and there are things that work very well for some people and not at all for others. They can actually be counterproductive.
Yeah.
And so the more you are wed to a specific approach, the less effective you can be as a coach or an athlete, because you refuse to even consider, let alone experiment with things that may work better for you. Yeah. And so it's one of these things where you look at something, okay, well, this worked well, but because it worked well, that doesn't mean there isn't a better way, right? It just means that your experimentation needs to be less dramatic, right? You're making minor changes and adjustments. Yeah. Whereas if something doesn't work at all, you need a drastic change. Like you've got to change it completely, more of a revolutionary kind of a change versus an evolutionary kind of change.
I think that's like the telltale sign of coaching experience is that I think as a junior coach, you're like, everything that worked for me is going to work for everybody that I coach.
Right.
Here's the program.
This is the way.
This is going to get you all those PRs. And the further you get, the more you realize, okay, this is the type of athlete it's going to work for this program and all that stuff and connecting those dots. So that's cool. That's well said.
Again, taking that kind of philosophical bent, when you are first getting started, it's this idea that this is the path to success right here. And that is a narrow single track little path.
Yeah.
The better you get or the more experience you get, you recognize, yes, this is the path. You are on the path, but the path is really wide.
Yeah.
Right. And so there's so much latitude along the way, from the same starting and end points, you're still moving in that same direction with those same fundamentals that you always believed in, most likely.
Yeah.
But there are so many different ways to achieve it, within that same basic trajectory.
Yeah. Fair enough. Well said. I want to touch a little bit on injury prevention. I know like at the basic level, do mobility, recover, programming, technique. Is there more to it than that? Has your opinion of injuries in weightlifting changed over the years, or what's your sort of philosophy around that?
Yeah, it really is the combination of all the elements, right? Being smart about your approach to everything.
Mm-hmm.
I think certainly the one thing that's maybe underrepresented in terms of injury, though, is sleep.
Yeah.
And so we look at sleep as part of recovery in general, but we think of that as more like, oh, I just need to rest up from this last workout for my next workout.
Yeah.
But it is truly a part of injury prevention and part of pain prevention and all these sorts of things. Like it does everything for you. So that's a big part of it.
Yeah.
And so again, you have to look at things holistically. You can't just look at a training program on your app or on your Excel document or whatever, your notebook, and say, this is a good program. You have to look at it within the context of this athlete's life and not generally, right? Like, oh, this athlete has a great life, super calm, home situation, whatever. But day to day, that stuff's going to change, right?
Yeah.
Well, girlfriend broke up with him and now he's bummed out and he's missing a 70% jerk and throwing his belt in the corner and stomping off. Got to adjust the program. It's not the perfect program right now. And so with the injury prevention, it is, appropriate volume, frequency, and loading, for that person's background, experience level, whatever. Yeah. It is ensuring that you are not consistently overreaching in terms of, say, like range of motion and position. Like you are not forcing somebody into positions they're not prepared for.
Right.
It's going to happen, right? Because the newer you are, the less consistent you are in those positions. So of course you're not going to hit the right position every time.
Yeah.
But as a coach and as an athlete, it's being able to recognize when that's kind of appropriate, acceptable divergence from quote unquote safe.
Yeah.
Which there has to be some margin there.
Yeah.
And when it's just like, no, you're just being an idiot and you are creating so much unnecessary risk. Like you are not achieving anything by increasing this risk. You are just making it worse for yourself. And I think, and I hesitate to even bring this up, but I think you look at kind of the CrossFit influence on weightlifting, and I take that back. It's not even the CrossFit influence. It just happens to be the convergence of that demographic. CrossFit attracts a certain demographic, and that tends to be people who are just super hard charging.
Yeah. They
don't want to rest. They don't want to take breaks. They don't want to recognize and adjust for pain.
True.
And so you have this subset of athletes or exercisers or whatever they are, who accumulate injuries that shouldn't be accumulating those injuries.
You just keep going, plowing through because they're like addicted to it.
You got a 55-year-old insurance broker who's had 2 slap tear surgeries. Like, what are you doing, man?
It's wild.
And so it's that attitude, I think, where you don't want to be a diaper baby about it. Like, oh, I have this tiny little discomfort in my wrist, so I'm not going to snatch for 3 weeks.
Yeah.
Well, that's ridiculous. Yeah. You're never going to accomplish anything.
Yeah.
But it's like, hey, one of my metacarpals has been dislocated for a month and I'm just snatching away on it and, taking, 1,600 milligrams of ibuprofen a day. And it's like, well, cool. Your bone is now dead and rotting. Now it's going to have to be removed and you're never going to be able to snatch again. Yeah. So it's like, you have to find that balance. I think that's the biggest thing is the mentality, of recognizing that there is a certain degree that you have to push it. Yeah. That degree changes based on your goals.
Yeah.
Right. Do you want to do this for fun? Do you want to do it for health? Do you want to do it for maximum performance? So those are 3 totally different goals that have different thresholds of kind of acceptable pain and discomfort.
Yeah.
and injury risk.
Yeah.
And so, but it's being flexible day to day again on what is appropriate for what you're trying to achieve.
Yeah. Cool. I think talking about stubborn CrossFitters, a nice segue into tough. So let's talk about the book a little bit. I love the way you laid it out. I love that there's different layers of character, capability, capacity, commitment, and all those pieces. Cause I think that's probably the best way for any kind of skill development is look at from identity down to environment and everything in between. Talk about and you talk in the first chapter about how you kind of revamped it a little bit. Talk about those early days in development. What was kind of the main motivation kind of scope when you first started writing it?
I mean, the very first notes I took was actually a book that was essentially about training.
Yeah.
And it was about an approach to training and kind of a mentality about training. And it was sort of the kind of born again hard mentality where it's like, it's so stupid. Like, this generation is soft. They're a bunch of babies. We got to toughen them up again. And it's not like, men aren't the way they used to be. And it was not to that degree of ridiculousness, but it was more that kind of approach, like kind of the disappointed, tough guy dad kind of like wagging his finger at his crybaby children. Like you guys need to get out in the backyard and dig some holes. This is embarrassing. So it was more of that approach. And I think that's why I never really pursued it for so many years, because it didn't resonate with me. It's like that was my initial idea, but it's just like, this is dumb. Like this is not what I really want to say. This is not really what I believe.
Yeah.
And so I think it took that 10 more years since I initially had the thought of, gaining more experience, getting a little bit older, getting a little bit more mature.
Yeah.
And having these real basic ideas kind of like percolate through all that experience, so that I could kind of refine it a little bit more, kind of get it to its essence, then I could then build back up from there. Yeah. And that sounds like such a complex process. Like I was actively doing this, totally a passive thing. This was just all happening in the background.
Yeah.
And then one day I was like, hey, I should try to write this book, and kind of sat down and realized that I had a better idea of where I was trying to go with it finally.
Yeah. Yeah. I love that. And even hearing you describe it, it kind of makes sense after reading through first half of it or so. Cause you talk about the image of tough versus the authenticity of tough, and where the goals are not to try to convince the world that you're tough, but if you're actually tough, it's almost the opposite. You almost want to conceal it. You only use it internally or when you need it.
Right.
So I love that description. Talk through that development of character, at the top of the chain. How does one start to develop authentic toughness?
Yeah. So the character piece has to be first, because that is the foundation of everything else. And interestingly enough, I think that's the part of this process that gets most commonly skipped or overlooked or kind of dismissed as being unimportant. So we look for we look for just the practical side of things.
Yeah.
So I want to get tough. So for the next 2 months, I'm going to do something every day that scares me, whatever the current Instagram kind of hashtag is, whatever. And it's like, well, okay, but that's a good thing to do, but why, what exactly are you trying to achieve, and why?
Yeah.
What is this doing for you as a human being, and what, kind of what missing pieces is this plugging up in your life?
Yeah.
And so the character, the identity is recognizing, well, I shouldn't say recognizing, is kind of determining who you want to be, who you are, who you want to be, and then reverse engineering this stuff. So I want to be this person.
Yeah.
Now, what would this person do? What would this person say in this situation? How would this person behave in this situation?
Right.
And then building those habits and that mindset to suit that identity.
Yeah.
Versus going the other way, which is what we typically do, and kind of just taking the actions without understanding really what their purpose is, and then kind of based on that retroactively describing our character based on those things, which then is really not authentic.
Right. Yeah. I think, and the other thing you talk about the impact of emotions, and I think you described it really well in the sense that we need to feel all these emotions. We just can't let them guide us to unfavorable behavior. And I think you're more prone to that route if you go straight to the environment and the actual habits, as opposed to starting at the top of the chain and working your way down through those pieces. Talk through that sort of description because you worded it really well. What's your take on emotional response and managing your emotions as you work your way through becoming, quote unquote, more tough?
Well, we have to remember that emotion is part of being human, right? And so we have this, the current kind of fashion is this kind of stoic approach to life. Mm-hmm. And I think there's so many good things that came out of the Stoic philosophy, but there's a lot of misunderstanding and misrepresentation about it too. And people's look at the kind of idiomatic use of the word stoic. It's like this emotionless, unfeeling, rock hard person,
social robots,
right? Who just sits on the edge of his neatly made bed in this like bare walled room, single light bulb, and just like grits his teeth and goes through life just like hating everything and feeling nothing besides that. It's just like, well, what is this? Why do you want to live like that? And the only answer would be because you want other people to see you living like that and be impressed. And that probably is kind of a kick in the knackers for some guys right now, but it's ridiculous. So my point being, we have to have both the intellectual, the reasonable, rational side and the emotional side to be a fully functional human being. And by that, I mean a human being who can actually engage in life, enjoy life, find fulfillment, contentment, satisfaction, quote unquote, happiness, however we define that. But the key is with both of those things, managing them in a way that allows us to experience life without being a victim of life, without being a victim of our own kind of neuroses and emotional whims or peaks and troughs. And so like recognizing, something like anger, which, I've been kind of an angry guy most of my life. And I would say not without justification, there's a lot of things to be angry about in the world. But learning to be able to step back and say, what am I so pissed off about? Why is this emotion coming up? And what should I do in response to it that's actually going to benefit me?
Right.
Versus again, just being the guy who's sitting there stewing in his own rage. And going, every Friday night, just going to a bar and picking a fight because you have no way to like get rid of this
otherwise. For sure. Yeah. Well said. Cool. The other point I want to talk about in the book, you mentioned a few kind of development tools. And this was actually, we just did like a review of the first year, and like just about every one of the guests that I've had on has kind of promoted meditation. It's interesting because if you look at like 10 years ago, I think it was still like considered like witchcraft and stuff like that.
Right.
But it's legit. Like the research is backing it. It's better for focus. It's better for, emotional management. It's better for sleep, getting into parasympathetic state, a whole bit. Right. So there's no real debate. And talk about journaling, talk about those two kind of pieces, tools, and how they can be useful specifically to developing a sort of tougher mindset.
Yeah, those are tricky ones. And it's kind of a hard sell to people, especially when you're using the word tough, because those seem to be two totally different demographics, right? I had the same kind of attitude about it for many years. And it's like, oh, what is this like new age garbage? Like, come on, man. Like what a bunch of whiny children. And so I think the first part of it is separating your preconceived notions about what journaling and meditation are. And so we have this idea that meditation is, you got to get naked, put on the cloth diaper, and get in the lotus position out in the mountains. And it's like, well, that's silly. This is just a simple, practical, way to kind of regulate breathing. And a way to not control, but to effectively deal with kind of the passing thoughts that come through your mind. That's all it is. And so, using the word tools is a great way to put it, because a tool is this very utilitarian thing.
Mm-hmm.
And, its effectiveness is totally dependent on your ability to use it and your understanding of how it works, what its purpose is, et cetera.
Yeah.
And the same can be said for journaling and meditation. You can do the whole new agey, misty mountaintop kind of meditation if that's what you're into. For most people, it's inaccessible. They don't have time. They don't have the interest in that. That's not what they're trying to achieve.
Yeah.
And so learning how to break it down into the most practical things, which is what I try to do in the book. Like, listen, these are like, the 2 or 3 things that have to be present for meditation to be functional.
Yeah.
Just start here. If you want to get more into it, then that's cool. You can pursue that.
Yeah.
And the journaling is the same thing. Like, this isn't Dear Diary, Todd was ignoring me in class today. I'm so sad, whatever. You can do that stuff too, but it is a practical tool to, every single day lay out, who am I? How do I show that data? How do I prove that day to day that this is who I am? This is what's important to me.
Yeah.
And then, am I actually doing this?
Yeah.
And so to kind of define who you are, what you need to do, and then evaluate how effective you have been at implementing that stuff.
Right. I love that. Well said. So let's talk about, I want to shift gears into your own kind of personal habits. I know you've not necessarily competing in the sport of weightlifting anymore. So what does your routine look like around fitness, health, your own kind of mental health priorities? What do your habits look like around that?
So I retired from weightlifting basically in 2016, which is hard. I can't believe it's 2022 already. It seems like it was just yesterday.
I know.
And then a few years ago, I kind of got talked into competing in something called the Tactical Games by a friend of mine.
Okay.
Which was so outside my wheelhouse. I just kind of had to say yes. And then I've ended up doing over a dozen of those in the past 3 years. So that's my physical training is geared toward that, primarily, not exclusively, not overwhelmingly necessarily, but definitely a majority is geared toward that.
That's like adventure style racing.
It is essentially it's a shooting sport, but it's a combination of, it's like a 2-gun shooting competition, but with some very demanding athletic components.
Oh, cool.
So, anything you can think of, like there was a 12-mile, 40-pound ruck one time.
Okay.
And so it's a 2-day thing. It's with usually 6 to 8 events over that 2 days. The national championship is 3 days. It's pretty rough. But it was this really odd combination of skill, athletic ability, and just kind of enjoyable misery. I don't know how to describe it. It seems like such a bad idea, but for some reason it's appealing.
Yeah.
And so totally different from weightlifting in every possible respect.
Yeah.
But so my training is I still have the strength kind of skeleton. I'm still doing snatches and clean and jerks in some variation every single week, once each a week. But then on top of that, I'm doing more conditioning stuff and odd object lifting, carrying, dragging. I'm actually running regularly, which is not something I've done since I was much younger.
Yeah.
And the other part of it too is the nice thing is I can kind of train for the Tactical Games competitiveness, but the stuff I'm doing is also allowed me to do things that I've done most of my life, but kind of had to step away from because I was a competitive weightlifter. So for example, backpacking, these things, getting outside, these kind of outdoor things that required a level of conditioning, and a level of freedom away from the gym, which you don't have as a weightlifter. Like you have this very rigid thing that you got a ball and chain, and that ball is in the gym, right? And it's a short chain. And so there is that health longevity side of things. I'm a smarter about what I do, in terms of, is this worth, breaking myself in half for now that I'm 42 and I want to, hopefully live past 50, and orthopedically be functional. And then mental habits is a tricky one for me because I work so much. It's a difficult balance to get done what I need to get done without totally overwhelming myself and driving myself into the ground that I can't continue doing.
Right.
And so learning, I've become better and better at forcing myself to step back more regularly. Or I shouldn't say regularly because it's still irregular, but more frequently. Like not wait 8 months until I'm almost having to go check myself into a hospital to recover or whatever. And then I lose all this time working and enjoying life anyway. So now forcing myself to try to take a little bit of time here and there to do non-work stuff has been the big key for me. And having a daily journal, I have a solid morning routine that I've done for years. I get up, I make my coffee, I go for a walk. And luckily I live in a place where I can go walk outside for a while. I sit down and do my morning journal, and then I'll pick up my phone, check email, and start working and doing that more kind of soul crushing side of life.
I love that. So checking in with yourself before you're checking in with the world.
Yep.
Very cool. Awesome. Well, Greg, this has been an amazing chat. What's the best place for people to follow more of your content?
CatalystAthletics.com or on Instagram as @CatalystAthletics. That's kind of the portal for everything I do. If you're looking for something I do, you can find it on one of those two places. If you're looking for the new book, Tough specifically, becomingtough.com and @becomingtough on Instagram. And you can find all kinds of kind of excerpts and whatever. If you need convincing to buy the book, there's plenty of that content on there for you to try to kind of nudge you in the right direction, make the right choice. Cool. And then, that's pretty much it. That's where I'm most active.
Awesome. Very cool. Well, I can concur. It's a good, solid read. I've really been enjoying it. Appreciate the time, Greg.
I appreciate it.
All right. Enjoy your day.
Thank you.
Talk soon. Thanks for tuning into this episode of Healthspan Academy, guys. We'll see you next time. Hey, what's up, guys? Thanks for tuning in today. Hope you enjoyed the episode. Thank you so much for supporting this channel. This has been a fun project. We're growing in viewership every single week, and we obviously couldn't do that without you. So thank you for continuing to tune in. I really hope you're getting value out of the programming and the content. Just wanted to give you a heads up. I've been working on a book on health and longevity the last couple of years, been collaborating with my colleague, Dr. Dan Vitale, who's an expert in the field as well. And we've basically just kind of summarized the literature, some of the techniques that we found really useful in the world of biohacking, what our exercise regimen looks like, what's, cardio type stuff is going to help us live longer and healthier, mobility work, nutrition. We've covered the whole spectrum, everything that you can basically be in control of in your health and fitness kind of moving forward to help you live as healthily as possible for as long as possible. And it's available free for download. So if you click on the YouTube banner, you'll see a link to download the blueprint. It's also on our Instagram profile or on the website. You can click on 5pillarmethod.com/optimize to get your free copy of the book. And I hope you enjoy it. Hope you're keeping well. Thanks again for tuning in, and we'll see you next time.